Hi, welcome everyone. Amanda, fabulous costume. Thanks for turning that camera on super quick. Hope you guys caught that. It's awesome. Welcome. My name is Bethany Williams. I am the Ohio, Kentucky IIDA chapter president. And thank you for joining us for our last Friday forum of the year. Evidently, we missed an opportunity for having this Halloween costume themed. Next year, we'll plan a little bit more accordingly. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I think we've got most of our group here trickling in. Megan, if you can go ahead and click over to the next slide for me. All right, before we get started, I want to give some quick thank yous to our event planning committee. So we have Megan Mershman, who is our VP of Special Events for the chapter, who helped plan this, along with some awesome people out of our Toledo City Center. So Alicia, Maria, Emma, Katie, and Brianna all were a huge helping hand in putting together this event. So thank you all for your hard work on this. I also want to take a minute to thank our chapter benefactors. They are the ones who financially support our chapter throughout the whole year, and we cannot do these events without them. Megan, if you could go ahead and click over to the next slide for me, we'll take a look at them. Our platinum benefactors are Interface, Patcraft, Shaw Contract, and Tarkett. Our gold benefactors are All Steel, J&J Flooring. Our silver benefactors are Alamere, Hayworth, IDNA, KIHDA, Kimball, Knoll, and Louisville Tile. And our bronze benefactors are Abco Signs, Bruce Longino Group, Dan Binford and Associates, Dupler Office, EPD Window Film, Hampton Products, Herman Miller, King Business Interiors, Loth, Milliken, Steelcase, Technion, Tim O'Neill and Associates, and Web Contract Associates. So thank you all for your generous support this year. Our presentation today is Gentelligence, the revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce. We do have 1 hour accredited for this program for IDCEC credits, which we will show a QR code at the end of the presentation that if you have the IDCEC app on your phone, you'll just need to log in, open it up, and then within the app there is a camera option to turn on a camera and scan the QR code. You cannot scan the code directly from your camera app on your phone. You have to do it through the app. So if you don't have the app yet, go ahead and download it and get ready, and we'll show that at the end of the presentation. Because I know everyone is going to love this presentation so much and learn so much and want to learn further, we're going to raffle some books at the end. We have 5 of Dr. Megan's books, the Gentelligence book that we will raffle at the end, so stick around. If you're here and hearing this now, your name is automatically being entered into this raffle, and we'll give those away at the end. So let's introduce our speaker. Dr. Megan Gerhardt is a speaker, consultant, author, and professor of management and leadership at the Farmer School of Business at Miami University, where she also serves as director of leadership development for the Farmer School and the Robert D. Johnson co-director of the Isaac and Oxley Center for Business Leadership. Megan has published widely on individual differences, motivation, leadership, and generational differences in the workplace. And her work has been featured on Forbes.com, NBCnews.com, The Washington Post, The Chicago Tribune, The San Francisco Chronicle, Market Watch, The Houston Chronicle, and Inc.com and Inc. magazine, among others. In 2017, her TEDx talk, Why I Love Millennials, and You Should Too, was released. As the creator of Gentelligence movement, Dr. Gerhardt's work focuses on leveraging individual differences to achieve leadership impact and extraordinary levels of performance. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Megan Gerhardt for our presentation.
Well, thank you so much and welcome everyone. It's great to be here on a Friday, a fantastic way to wrap up the week for me. I hope it will be for you as well. So, and thank you for that introduction. It's always strange to have people talk about you while you're sitting there, but I want to actually start with a story about what has really brought me to be so passionate about this work. So I began my career as a professor when I had just turned 26. So I was pretty young, didn't know a whole lot about a lot of things. And like many of us, I turned to my older colleagues for advice, for guidance. And interestingly, because I was so close in age to my students at that time, I found myself turning kind of in the other direction for their input, their feedback on a variety of different things that I was putting together, classes I was teaching. And I really realized that I learned just as much leaning that way as I did the other. And it has become very much a career strategy that I use. It's how I learn now, even to this day, when I am not even close in age to my students. So I really embrace that as a great learning opportunity, a way to innovate, a way to, create something new. And because of this, I became really fascinated with looking at how generational differences were being leveraged in the workplace. And I started doing not only academic research, but also speaking to different groups like yours about 12 years ago on this topic. And what I found, probably not surprisingly to any of us today, but what I found was that my positive view on working across different generations was not necessarily widely shared. And I became really focused on trying to understand why and what we could do about it. So that led us to what we're going to talk about today, which is what I call Gentelligence. And we'll talk about what that actually means. But my hope today is that we can really shed some light on a topic that I think is not understood well. I think it's talked about a lot, but not understood well, and maybe provide some tools and strategies for you to approach this and see this in a slightly different way than you have in the past. So that's my hope and my goal today. Excited to take questions. Feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll definitely leave some time to answer questions towards the end of the hour today. So let's talk a little bit about where generational differences come from. And I want to make sure, if you have had a generational talk or gone through generational training before, that this isn't the same old talk that you've heard. There's a lot of debate out there. Even in the last week and a half, I've been sent so many articles from the Wall Street Journal, from the New Yorker, about whether generations are a myth, whether we need to really care about them. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. But generation is really best thought of as a layer of your identity, right? So it's not everything that you are, right? And any of these sort of stereotypes or broad categorizations that if you're a millennial or you're a baby boomer, you are, all of these things, those are stereotypes. That's lazy. We're not here to do that. But generational identity, the time in history which you were born and grew up, is an interesting and important layer of who you are. And by calling it a layer, we acknowledge that it's going to interact with all kinds of other things. It's going to interact with your gender identity, your race, your ethnicity, your religion, your socioeconomic status, where you grew up in the world, and even your age. So age and generation are obviously a little bit different. You could be an older or a younger millennial, for example, and that's going to make a difference. So that's how we talk about it in the book, that it's one layer of who you are that really does impact in some fascinating ways the way you see the world and your place in it. So where does that come from? Well, we know through research that there are formative experiences that impact a generation. So a generation is roughly 15 to 20 years of time. And formative experiences tend to be things that happen early in life, so during childhood and young adulthood, that actually have a stronger effect on you if you experience them during that period than they would if you experience them later in life. So the pandemic is a good example that we all are living through it. But research tells us that the people that live through it during age, let's say, 6 to 24-ish type time period, it's going to have a much more profound effect on the rest of their life because it's impacting the opportunities that are going to be available to them, the way they view work, the way they view life, the way they have, taken perspective on what opportunities are and aren't good paths for them. And so when you think about when you grew up, right, the formative experiences, things that were happening culturally, politically, economically, socially, the way you were raised, what were the parenting norms of the day, those all have pretty interesting effects on our internalized values. So we'll talk later today about the fact that we all have universal needs. Generations are alike in really important and interesting ways, but we also do have different frequencies of values that stem in part from those formative experiences. And those are the things that then result in the behaviors and attitudes we experience in the workplace. Things that we may not understand or recognize because they look very different from somebody older or younger than what makes sense to us looking through our generational lens. So that's why I like to call it a lens. I think if you think about the fact that you're viewing work, family, life, opportunities, work-family balance, really almost everything in part through the lens of your generational identity, that makes it an interesting perspective to consider rather than this broad brush stereotype that is the subject of so many clickbait headlines. And that's what we want to stay away from that if we can. All right, so I love this quote. It's a quote from Vanity Fair, and it really sums up the way that I think generations are best thought of, right? It's these shared experiences, the things you know that people around your age experience just like you. We talk a lot about the role of technology, that it played a different role for me during my education and my childhood than it maybe did for somebody 20 years younger or older. And how does that impact the way that I use it even today, or the way that I see its role in work or entertainment or any of those different things. All right, so let's do a quick snapshot of the generations defined. And as I go through these, I'm just going to give you what I like to call a generational narrative. So not a stereotype, but really the idea of what is kind of the snapshot of these generations that we seem to know and understand, some of the things we would count as formative experiences, and some of the values or attitudes or behaviors that we see in higher frequencies in people in these generations. So right now we have 5 generations working together in organizations. So we have 6 living generations right now, but probably 5 that realistically are working. So we're going to do a quick overview just so that we're all understanding the generational dates and you can figure out where to place yourself. And I use the Pew Research Center dates. So there's different dates floating around, and the Pew Research Center is a neutral think tank. And what I like about that is it gives us sort of a set of dates that everybody can use. So we're not, arguing about where to cut a generation, which is a little bit more art than science sometimes. So the greatest generation, born prior to 1928, this is the generation that really bore the brunt of, and of course, I should say these are US-centric generations. They do differ around the world. But the greatest generation bore the brunt of World War II, as well as growing up in the wake of the Great Depression and all of the things that those two significant global events brought to opportunity, to education, and to work as well. If we move to the silent generation, these are going to be the children of the greatest generation, particularly the ones that some of them fought in World War II, but didn't see the bulk of the fighting. Many of them felt very fortunate that they didn't have the extent or amount of hardships that their parents' generation did. This generation is often nicknamed the lucky few because there's not very many of them. They're small in size, and they felt very lucky that no matter what they had to take on, it wasn't the Great Depression and, heading headfirst into the fighting in World War II. Interestingly, Joe Biden was our first silent generation president. We had a string of baby boomer presidents before that, to the point where we thought we would never have one from the silent generation, but Biden actually is and probably will be our only silent generation president. This generation, a lot of them retired prior to the recession of 2008. They were really the last generation that largely got to enjoy pensions and didn't have to necessarily need to worry to the same extent about retirement. Of course, now getting to the baby boomers, one of the most talked about generations, the largest generation for a very long time, although that has been a title claimed by millennials now. The baby boomers are the only generation recognized by the US Census, obviously named for the boom of growth and population growth after World War II. This generation had a lot of hope and optimism put on it by their parents, who were hoping they were going to help rebuild the country and help rebuild the economy, a generation that we attribute with much of the success in things like women's rights, civil rights, a generation interested in lots of change, social change when they were young, and also the generation that really coined and popularized the term workaholic. So this is the generation that actually invented the 60 to 70 hour work week. They defined success, many of them, as a position on the corporate ladder. And that was a social norm as baby boomers were starting their careers, that you worked hard, you put your head down, similar work ethic to their parents' and grandparents' generation, but wanted to accomplish more and accumulate more success and wealth than their parents had been able to. So they felt like they had a lot of opportunity, they should take advantage of it. Now, this is where, to me, the story gets more interesting, maybe because this is where I enter into the story. But the children of the oldest baby boomers were Gen Xers. So that's my generation. I'm 44. And our boomers, working hard, they were really the generation that had the first dual career families, right? Because of women's rights, we had both mom and dad potentially working outside the house. And a sharp increase in single parent families because of women's rights, right? So we had more single parent families. And the reason I bring that up around Gen X is this was a generation where, if that was the case, if mom and dad were working 60 hours a week or both working and nobody was home, as had been the case in prior generations, this is a generation that maybe enjoyed the last surge of independence. So there was no such thing as widespread daycare when I was little. There was not, very much daycare at work, like, workplace daycare. So this meant a lot of kids that were, when they were old enough, were able to come in home after school, let themselves with the key into the house, and that popularized this term called latchkey kids. And if I ask my students today, they don't have no idea what a latchkey is. So that's just a reminder, right? That you got to remember sort of that things change quickly, but also an independent generation that was sort of left to their own devices. It was an interesting mix of being given independence, but also taught about caution. So instead of Woodstock and civil rights for the baby boomers, we always say about Gen X, we had the Challenger disaster and the AIDS epidemic, stranger danger, say no to drugs. So sort of a little bit of both, like run free, but be really careful. So those are some of the narratives around Gen X. And this was a generation where, for the first time in really memorable history, they looked at their parents and how hard they were working. And many of us said, interesting, I'm not sure that's the path for me, right? Like, mom and dad work so much. What are they getting from it? And maybe I want more balance. Maybe I want to define success differently. Maybe I don't want to, sacrifice so much for my career. And when we began our careers, we pushed back a little bit about how much we wanted to work. And this is where the Gen X nickname slacker generation comes from. Now, again, we have to be careful not to stereotype. I don't consider myself a slacker, but I do understand the narrative that many people in my generation define success in a much more broad way. We work to live, not live to work, is often the saying. And to the baby boomers, through their lens, that very much did look like slackers, right? So that's where the narrative to me gets super interesting. We always push back a little on the generation before us and want to kind of craft our own path forward. So now we get to the millennials, one of the most discussed generations ever, the most educated generation, the most developed generation. The millennials are mostly the children of the youngest baby boomers. And remember, those baby boomers working incredibly hard to achieve and provide opportunities for their families that their parents and grandparents did not have the option to accomplish. So it came from a really good place. But our millennials were the start of what we call the overscheduled generation. So this parenting philosophy of the children are our future, let's invest in them. Let's sign them up for language classes and sports lessons and music lessons and all of these things at an age nobody had ever even considered before, right? 3-year-old soccer and 5-year-olds in Spanish, and the whole entire family unit revolving around the kids' development, their needs, their schedule, was a 180 from even 2 generations earlier, right? No longer was it children should be seen and not heard. It was children as the center of the family. Because what would be possible if we invested in their self-esteem, right? And we gave them all these opportunities, all coming again from a really good place. But what happened then is not only were they very much given opportunities, development, and advantages that have been very beneficial, they were under a ton of pressure. To get into college, suddenly the bar was incredibly high. To get into a good college, I just had to graduate high school and have a decent ACT score. And then one generation later, as many of you know, if you are in this generation or you have kids in this generation, the bar got very, very high because everybody had so many opportunities, at least in a higher socioeconomic class. It's important to say that more relevant for people who had more means. These kids really had a lot of accomplishments and development at a much younger age than prior generations had ever seen. So when they came to college and then to your workplaces, they came with a strong sense of self. They came with a very strong history of being allowed to have a voice and have a role and be an important part of what was going on. But when they showed up in class and at work and wanted to have a voice and wanted to have input or wanted to, do things earlier than other people had done them, we didn't like it. And that's where the most recent surge in generational tension came from, right? It really did start with the millennials, who were a gigantic generation, showing up and being so different. I remember clearly when this happened at the university, and this is really when my work on this began. It shouldn't be a surprise, right? That's how they were raised. But when they became our employees and wanted to progress quickly and have a voice, we weren't so sure about that. There's other formative experiences, things like digital savvy, being digital natives, things like that. But really the parenting philosophies were the ones that led to a very strong shift in the role and expectations. And millennials were really cast in this very negative light that they were entitled. And I've done a lot of work talking about the fact that you can see it as entitled, but they see it as proactive. They see it as doing exactly what they were raised to do. And how you look at it depends on where you're standing. All right, now finally, just released Gen Z. So our Gen Zs, the oldest of them are 24 this year. So if you were doing the math, the oldest millennials are 40. So we can't be calling young people millennials anymore. Not that 40 is not young, but our youngest people in the workplace are Gen Zs. Gen Zs are born 1997 until the cutoff date I've seen anywhere right now from 2010 to 2016. And part of the reason we're hedging on that is because of the pandemic. So if you look at this prior slide, people ask me a lot why millennials don't include the year 2000 as a birth year, which is an excellent question. And the reason is because we want everybody who's a millennial to have an active memory of the turn of the millennium, right? 99 to 2000. So we cut it at 96 with the argument that, okay, you'd have to be at least 4 years old to remember, the ringing in of the year 2000. That's the mentality. And also to remember things like 9/11. So if you use that same sort of school of thought for Gen Zs, I'm guessing we'll probably cut it closer to 2015 or 2016, depending on, what the final word is on that. So I get a lot of questions. Who are Gen Zs? How do we get ready for them? It's interesting because they're, somewhere between 5 and 24 years old, depending on where we want to look. So it's hard to say. I think if we focus on the working age Gen Zs, right, that's where our narrative is right now. We know this is a generation that grew up, the recession happened when they were children. The pandemic significantly has disrupted their early job opportunities. Lots of them had job offers taken away or spent their first year and a half working remotely, never stepping foot in an office. And that's had all kinds of interesting things in terms of impact on their commitment, things like that. This is the generation that grew up with fake news. They also grew up with school violence, and we will see what that does to their, view of work and career. So far, what we're seeing is much less reliance on an organization, that they are much more entrepreneurial, either in being part of the gig economy or they are interested in getting a secure job because they understand and have been through sort of enough economic turmoil in their families or their communities to understand the importance of it, maybe more so than the millennials did. But also understanding that maybe you don't need just one career or one job, right? That you can start your own business online, but also have a day job, right? And piecing together, particularly with the options of remote and flexible work, who says what a career is going to look like for them, right? They're going to have jobs that don't even exist yet. And of course, with the Great Resignation and things like that, we're seeing a lot of them. And I just got sent an article last night from the New York Times about how they are setting their own sort of parameters about what they want in a job, just like every generation before them has done. So we can talk about all kinds of things around that, social media, but in general, we're seeing these take some different paths, make some different choices, maybe not necessarily embrace the idea of a 4-year degree the way that prior generations were told they needed to. Lots more interest in things like technical training, apprenticeships, on-the-job training, things like that that might have an impact for you and your employees. All right, so now that we sort of have our foundation, let's talk about the interesting part, which is if we think about other kinds of difference, right? If you think about diversity in terms of race or ethnicity or religion or gender identity, we know and understand that we have a responsibility and an obligation to be inclusive, that being inclusive is beneficial for our businesses, for everyone in them. And we have so many best practices on how to do that well, right? A lot of investment and interest in doing that well. But what I've always been fascinated by is the fact that that mentality and those best practices are very rarely applied to age or generations, right? So if you take even the okay boomer phenomenon that I'm sure you've all heard of that went viral in 2019, that is sort of a, viral social media put down based on a category of someone's identity that they can't control. Now, I have a 16-year-old son, and he would say, boomer doesn't have anything to do with your age, mom. It's a mindset. Okay, I get it. But at the same time, it's a derogatory term based on, the point in time somebody was born. In theory, that's how you define it. It's not any different from calling someone an entitled millennial, right? Or a Gen Z snowflake or a Gen X slacker. You're stereotyping someone in a negative way based on a point in time in history when they were born. And we seem to have given this a pass, right? Like you can absolutely find headlines everywhere, every day, using those sort of put downs. Interestingly, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, we write about this in the book, they actually decided just a few years ago that they were going to stop using derogatory terms to refer to millennials. Like they had to make a policy about it because it had gotten so bad. And it's this fascinating missing link that it's this important form of difference that we just somehow haven't included in any of these other conversations. So we viewed it as a contentious, competitive, negative conversation, and that's what needs to change. And that's where Gentelligence comes in. So I developed Gentelligence really as a way to be smarter about this. The fact that we know that well-managed diversity of all kinds can be a benefit to our organizations, to our teams. How do we make that happen with age and generation specifically? And how do we view diverse generational perspectives as opportunities instead of threats or something frustrating or annoying? So how do we change the conversation on this and be much more positive in a way that's going to benefit all of us? So Gentelligence is about championing all generations. It's not about favoring Gen Z and millennials over boomers and Gen Xers. It's about intergenerational learning and collaboration and what happens when we are collaborating and not competing. All right, so here's some stats to kind of break up the narrative here a little bit. Just some things I pulled from the last year. 35% of employees do believe their organization favors a particular generation. Depends on the industry, which direction this goes. So in tech, as you might imagine, it's younger generations to the point where there are so many age discrimination lawsuits out there. In things like manufacturing, it tends to be the opposite. If you know anybody who works in skilled trades, if you know anybody who is, working in manufacturing, the mean age in those industries is much older. It wasn't considered trendy or advised for millennials or Gen Xers to go into plumbing or electrician or being, a carpenter. My husband's a carpenter and he's the youngest person by far in almost every job he works in. So what's happened then is that there's this huge set of opportunities for our Gen Zs to go into those skilled trades, so much so that a lot of skilled trade employers are starting apprenticeships with, high schoolers. My nephew's in a welding apprenticeship, which is guaranteeing him a job and a lot of money if he goes into that line of work. So we're going to start seeing a lot more of that. Down at the bottom, something I've gotten a lot of conversation around is the fact that we have almost 40% of people now have a boss who is younger than they are. So think about whether this is true where you work. And this is coming from several places. One, it's the millennials who are at oldest 40 this year, very driven, many of them very interested in progressing in leadership ranks as quickly as possible. They also have benefited from these leadership rotational programs that became popular probably 10 or 15 years ago that were not available to Gen Xers or to boomers, where you go through a rotation or a track and then you're put into a leadership role after a certain period of time. They were a strategy to recruit millennials because that's what they were looking for, but it's resulted in some leapfrogging over Gen Xers specifically who didn't have that direct path. Also, Gen Xers not always as interested in necessarily hitting the highest rung. Many are saying, I'm happy with where I'm at. I have good balance. I don't want to take that next rung. You go ahead and take it. So some interesting challenges that come with having someone younger than you lead on both sides of things. And then finally, something that I'm talking a lot about these days, and that is baby boomer retirement. So every baby boomer in the US will be 65 by 2030. Not all of them are going to want to retire at 65. We're actually seeing a good number of them leaving organizations now as part of the Great Resignation, but not necessarily to retire. They may be leaving to start another gig, right? They're embracing the gig economy at some of the highest levels we see among any generation. So for employers, how do you make sure you don't lose decades of organizational knowledge and wisdom because you're not paying attention to your older workers, you're not developing them, you're not giving them growth opportunities because you just assume they wouldn't be here that much longer. So if we don't figure out a way to pass down some of that knowledge and expertise, we're going to lose a lot of it very, very soon. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you that we should be thinking more proactively about this amazing opportunity we have with lots of generations in the workplace to work together, but probably that's not the experience that many of you have had. So I want to talk about why. There are so many roadblocks that get in our way, and if we don't have a leadership strategy or we don't have a plan, we most likely will not experience Gentelligence or the benefits that are possible. So I'm just going to run down these pretty quickly. We've talked about some of them. The things that get in our way, of course, stereotypes. Stereotypes, assuming that, for example, a stereotype that older people don't use technology very well. There is zero research to back that up. Older people are just as capable of using technology as younger people. The differences lie in interesting things like how they choose to use it, or the learning curve on maybe how long it takes them to feel comfortable, as opposed to a younger person who would be part of the digital native who grew up with that iPad in their hand. So that kind of stereotype, of course, can prevent older people from getting opportunities that they very much would be able to and perhaps want to have, or being hired for jobs. I did a podcast interview yesterday with a gentleman who talks about older workers and their threat of being made redundant or feeling like they can't get new opportunities because of these stereotypes. We have age bias, and not just age bias against older people, but reverse age bias. So age bias against people who are younger, right? An assumption being made that you shouldn't have an opinion or shouldn't get a vote or don't have a valuable perspective because you're too young. And those kinds of age biases are not legally protected by any federal laws. So there's no federal laws protecting people under the age of 40 from discrimination based on age. So I won't call that a fun fact. There's some state laws that do, but no federal laws in the United States protecting you from being discriminated against and not getting a job because you're 30. That's actually totally legal. Generational shaming, I've talked about already. The last two, I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about. So the one about values perceptions, right? That you might hear people saying, I don't understand young people today, or the older people in my office, they don't get it. They don't understand what matters to us. Our research shows that we all share universal needs, that we all care about things like respect, connection, autonomy, meaningful work. It doesn't matter how old you are. Those have been found to be universal human needs. But the reason we have these perceptions that we have very different needs is because the way we go about fulfilling those needs, our pursuit of fulfilling those needs, is going to likely look quite different depending on the norms that were in place when we started our careers. So my example on this one, my dad is 73. He's an older baby boomer. He's a retired attorney. And when the book came out this summer, he said, yeah, I don't get it. When I started my career, I put my head down, did my work, worked hard, came in early, showed up, stayed late. And I waited for my boss to come tap me on the shoulder and tell me it was time for my promotion and that I had earned a raise, because that's how you get respect. That's how you gain respect, is you put your head down and you be quiet and you work hard. And then he said his younger associates would come and they would come tell him they thought they were ready for a raise and not the other way around. And to him, again, that looked very entitled. So we had this great conversation and I said, but they want the same thing you want, right? They wanted respect, and they were taught and raised that the way you get it, you should go ask for it. You go put your hand up, you let people know you're ready, you step into that. You just don't see it that way because that's not what the norm was when you were growing up and when you started your career. So you both have this need to prove yourselves and gain respect. You choose to pursue and fulfill that in a different way, and it leads to this miscommunication and this tension. And then finally, knowledge, relevance, and appreciation. So one of the reasons the millennials caused such a culture shock at work was that for the first time in recent history, our millennials had a type of knowledge inherent and natural to them that the rest of us had to learn. And that was digital knowledge, right? So not that we can't learn it, not that we aren't able to. Many of us invented the technology that millennials are very, adept at using, but they grew up with it, right? That's what that term digital native means. And because of that, they learned it faster. They were more interested in learning the newest thing. It was more natural to them. And that meant there was a type of expertise that younger people had that older people didn't yet. And this made people uncomfortable. This is where a lot of the tension and conflict came in. And somehow we decided that if they had valuable expertise, it somehow made our expertise less valuable. And that is something that creates this huge obstacle and roadblock to Gentelligence that we have to try to step away from. You knowing how to do something really well doesn't make what I know less important or relevant. And so that's what I really want us to try to step away from, right? It's possible that your unique expertise and experience is just as valuable as mine, but it's definitely true that if we could put those together, then we would really have something amazing. And that's what Gentelligence is about. But research tells us that it's just not going to happen naturally. If you look at an organization that has a multi-generational workplace, which almost all of us do, if it's just left to its own devices, you're going to get miscommunication, tension, frustration. You have to have a strategy. You have to have a plan. And that's what Gentelligence is about. I love this illustration. This actually ran with the very first article I ever wrote for NBC. And so I did a screenshot of it because I loved it so much. It just epitomizes the very unproductive dynamic we seem to have gotten ourselves into here. So are we ready for what's ahead? You know, there's so many challenges in the future of work, return to work, great resignation, AI, VI, you name it, you know, where will we work? How will we work? When will we work? We have some big challenges that we've never had to think about before, and we are not ready for them. And the reality is, you know, Deloitte's Workforce Trend 2021, so I pulled this just this year, showed that only 6% of organizations really believe their leaders were equipped to lead a multi-generational workforce, that they had any idea what to do with all of these kinds of differences. That's 6%. That is very, very low, and we can definitely do better than that. So I hope I've made a strong case that we do need to do better. And I'm going to give you a quick summary of the practices and strategies that we suggest in the book. And we try to put as many practical tools, case studies, examples as we can in there. But these are what we call the 4 Gentelligence practices. So I'm going to talk about them 2 at a time, just for the interest of time that we have here today. I want to make sure we have time for questions. The first 2 on the left are about breaking down tension. That if there is an existing tension, we can't just jump to the part where we try to benefit from difference. We have to address that kind of elephant in the room. And the way that we need to do that is we need to think about some key questions. And I put a few on the next slide just to give you an idea of maybe some things that you could even bring back to work next week. Right? Some different lenses to use. So the first one here, resisting assumptions. This, of course, is questioning stereotypes. That's the most obvious way to apply it, right? Are you assuming older people aren't interested in new learning opportunities? Are you assuming younger people shouldn't get a seat at the table because they haven't been there long enough to have an opinion? Those kinds of things. But I think the first question is actually more valuable in some ways, which is, what do you assume other people are understanding or defining the same way you do? I did a talk earlier this week for a global family business advisory practice, and they had talked about how different generations view retirement. That was one of their topics that they had recently discussed. And I kind of stopped the conversation and I said, have you asked different generations how they define the word retirement? That's what I would be interested in, right? Because baby boomers are defining retirement entirely differently than their parents' generation did. And most likely our Gen Zs and millennials may not retire at all. They may not think that they're ever going to be a day when they're going to never work. They may just not think of it that way. Maybe they're going to change how they work, right? So how did people in your team that are of different generations define success, define networking, define communication, define balance, you know, any kind of question, just not assuming they're using the same lens as you are. And that's what the second practice is about. This one's my favorite, is understanding that you don't see things the way they are, you see them the way you are, right? That's a Thoreau quote. That is not a Megan quote, but we see things through the lens of our own experience, you know, and my best sort of parallel to this is think about when you travel abroad. You understand inherently that there's a high likelihood you're going to be misunderstood, or that maybe you're going to misperceive a behavior or an attitude. So you work really hard to make sure that doesn't happen, because those people grew up in a different way than you did. And you understand maybe there's some things you need to pay attention to, and generations are the same, right? That you have to think about that behavior might mean something different in this context to those people than it does to me. I was doing this talk a few years ago for an emergency department staff. So it was nurses and doctors and all ages. And one of the challenges that was raised by a nursing manager who was older was she said, you know, we have a strict no phones in the exam room policy, yet, you know, these kids are pulling out their phones and not paying attention. And that's rude. I don't care what you say, it's rude. And so I stopped her and I said, okay, so they're pulling out their phones. Got it. Like, that's an objective, valid behavior that you're seeing. Like, that's something we can validate. Why did you immediately assume that meant they weren't paying attention to you? Like, I get it's a violation of policy, like I understand, but why are you assuming right away that means they're not paying attention? And she looked confused, and I just threw it to the crowd. I said, can somebody offer some things that could be happening with that phone that maybe counter that assumption or that viewpoint? And there were a lot of millennial doctors and nurses in the crowd, and they said, I take notes on my phone all the time. Or maybe I'm texting my roommate to see if we have Tylenol, or I'm looking up the hours of the pharmacy, or, the list went on and on. And it was really interesting because she started to realize that, yes, there's some portion that are on their phones not paying attention, but there's some portion that are very much paying attention and are focused on the same thing she's focused on, which is having a productive conversation. But she immediately jumped to something that made her frustrated and judgmental and upset, when likely that wasn't really happening as often as she thought. And the same thing happens when somebody pulls out a computer in a meeting. Like, we do that a lot more now that we're on Zoom, but think about the number of times somebody pulls out a device in a meeting. What do you immediately think? I know I immediately think, like, come on, we're having a meeting. You don't need your computer. Well, if you're 25 or 35, you might immediately think, well, I can't go to the meeting without my computer. That's how I take notes, or I'm going to look at the agenda, or I'm working on a doc that I'm going to share with everybody after the meeting. I have to stop myself every time. And this is what I do for a living. So adjusting your lens, what other explanations might there be for behavior that you are judging as rude, frustrating, inappropriate, entitled, outdated, name your adjective. The last two strategies are really ones that are about leveraging the power and potential that we're leaving on the table. The first one there about building trust is really about building psychological safety. And that's a very trendy term in leadership right now. But it basically means building an environment where everybody, regardless of age, feels like their ideas are welcome and feels like they also are able to ask for help. When we went remote last year, we had to get ready here to teach overnight on Zoom. So not only just attend meetings on Zoom, but we had to be ready to share slides and material and interact with students and give exams. And none of us, I don't care how old we were, nobody was ready. I immediately went to my students and said, okay, crowdsourcing, you guys have to help me. Like, let's do crash course, like Zoom. What are the hints? What do I need to know? Why is this button not working? Why can you not see my video? Like, I asked for help because I felt safe doing that. I didn't think they were going to think, Megan's such a dinosaur. Oh my gosh, why is she still teaching? I felt safe enough that I could trust them to help me and that they would be willing and happy to do that. I had a colleague who's maybe 15 years older than me. He's not even that comfortable using his phone or using email. And he sort of apologetically called and said, is there any way you could meet me? Like, we'll wear masks, but I have no idea what Zoom is, and I'm supposed to teach on it tomorrow. But he didn't want anybody else helping him. He wasn't going to ask his students, and he didn't want to talk about it because he didn't feel safe. He felt like he was going to be viewed as a dinosaur because he didn't immediately know Zoom. That's lack of psychological safety. And so it happens on the other side too, right? You want your younger people to share great ideas and also feel like they can ask for help if they need it. And if people feel like asking for help means I'm not competent, or, then we're not going to get that trust that we need. And then the final strategy there is one we snagged from the negotiation literature, which is the fact that there's a lot of opportunity if we're not in competition, right? If you having a great idea doesn't mean I'm suddenly irrelevant and not needed. If instead the unique, amazing idea and perspective of, let's say, a younger person can be welcomed and embraced and combined with the wisdom and experience of an older person, then we have something. But how do you do that? And I'm going to leave you with a really easy question that works for me that I probably use a couple times a week, which is, I'm interested in how you would do this, right? So let's say you are an older person on your team, you're trying to figure out return to work strategy. How many days a week do people have to be in the office? When should they be able to work from home? That's a sticky, hard problem. Asking people of every generation and age group, here's our challenge. How would you do it? You're asking for input. You're not letting them make the decision. Those are different. You ask for input and some magical things happen. One, people feel respected. Oh, she thinks I have a valid perspective. She respects me enough to ask for that input. Two, you're going to learn something, right? You're going to learn how different groups really feel, or what maybe you'll hear an innovative solution you hadn't thought of. And then you also open up the road for you to give feedback, right? So if I ask a younger person, this is our challenge, how would you do it? I'll hear it. And then I can say, interesting. Okay, I love that core idea. Here's some problems I think we might have with that. Like, here are the challenges. How would we navigate around those? And they're much more likely to hear that feedback than if you hadn't asked their approach, right? It's a mutual respect thing at its core, that they then think, well, she respected me, so I'm going to respect her and listen to her feedback. And then together we'll create something new and interesting. All right, so just to kind of wrap up, talked a little bit about those roadblocks at Gentelligence and those practices. And in the book, we do a deep dive, how do you apply that to things like people strategy, teams, leadership, culture, future of work, all of those incredible things. And really try to embrace this kind of difference with this mantra that all of us have something we can both learn and teach from those older and younger than us. So with that, I'm going to stop my share. We'll head back here. Any questions? I'm going to, while people are maybe deciding on their question, I'm going to drop in the chat, if you're interested, a link to sign up for my mailing list, which is, I don't send stuff out very often, but I'll send like updates, tools. Sometimes I send like a training exercise that's free. If something interesting is going on with this topic in the news, would love to have you sign up if you're interested. The link is in the chat. But yeah, any questions, anything I can answer for you guys?
Megan, I'll jump in with a question.
Great.
IIDA, we've talked about having some sort of more formal mentorship program rolled out. And I'm just wondering if you can shed any insight on what does mentorship mean for different generations? Are some more acceptant to it or resistant to it, or anything along those lines in mentorship?
Yeah, I think, first of all, one of the things that we really advocate for is what we call mutual mentorship. So I'm sure you've all heard of reverse mentorship, right? But it was actually our editor who said, well, I don't think reverse is a very Gentelligent term because it means backwards, right? So it assumes, bad on us. We didn't even notice that. Maybe we were just, exhausted from writing the book. But I thought it was really interesting. And the fact that it's not backwards to learn something from people who are younger. So I would say going in the area of mutual mentorship, where we're open up the fact that we all have something to teach and learn. And I think particularly, that is the tone, right? That it's not just older people taking younger people under their wing, but that is an important part of it. Generativity, which is, this idea of passing on your experience to another generation, is so powerful and important, but also creates, that sort of trusting relationship where the learning can happen the other way. So I would say mutual mentorship is what I would recommend. I think a lot of older people sometimes think that younger generations don't think they have anything to learn from older ones, and our research does not back that up. We find, starting with the Millennials as well as Gen Z, they crave mentorship. So they don't crave lectures or being talked down to, they crave connection with people who have a lot of experience and expertise. So I think that's a misperception that younger people don't think they have anything to learn from older people. We haven't found that to be true at all. So I think there's a real appetite for it. And I think, pairing people who are open to learning from one another is probably where you want to fall on that for sure. Looks like there's a question in the chat. So Brianna asked, if someone experiences negative comments or experiences for being younger in the workplace, how would you respond? I think it's hard not to sound entitled, but also being an advocate for yourself. Yeah, I think so too, because I think, okay, boomer is like the go-to response to that when you feel like someone's being patronizing to you because of your age. And that's actually where that came from, right? Gen Z was sort of like, well, if you're going to be patronizing to us, we're going to be patronizing back, and we have better tools. We have social media. So, there you go. Neither productive though. Let's just be clear, but clever. I like to sort of call out the elephant in the room and say, can you help me understand why you had that reaction or your perception? Because I think if you're called out for being, younger or entitled, right, to just sort of try to get at, you adjust your lens and say, that certainly wasn't my, intention. Can you help me understand why you had that reaction? Because I think you're dispelling their stereotype by asking that question, right? By saying, well, that wasn't my intention. Can you help me understand? I'm here to learn. And then again, you open up hopefully that conversation where they'll think, oh, now I have to think about why I had that reaction. Maybe you can help do a little, eye-opening to them about the fact that it didn't come from a place of entitlement. It came to wanting to contribute, or you actually were very interested in taking on more work and you didn't realize it would be perceived that way. And then, asking, well, what would your advice be for me if I really want to progress and work my way up in this company or wherever it's coming from? How would you do it? Right? Just sort of meeting it head on and asking those questions from a very genuine place, I think dispels their stereotype or their myth that you're being entitled. Let's see, another question. Is there another word to use for mentorship programs that won't have a negative or draining connotation for Gen Zs and millennials? That's interesting. You're over-mentored. That's a good question. I'll have to think on that. I think, I think anything intergenerational learning opportunities, maybe, or if it's we've seen some employee resource groups. Maybe it's a learning collaborative. It's a think tank, intergenerational think tank. I think I think changing the name can be important. I think even just saying mutual mentoring and setting some parameters that it's not about an older person just dumping their knowledge and wisdom on a younger person, but maybe everyone defines ahead of time 3 things they would love to learn from the other person, right? So we're setting the culture that this is a mutual intergenerational learning. It's not being talked at. That would be sort of my thought on it. Yeah, so it looks like I have the QR code up. Feel free to ask questions aloud or in the chat. I'm happy to stay on for a few. I know some people probably need to go, and I appreciate everybody tuning in. The book, my agent would be mad if I didn't tell you this. The book is on Amazon. It's also available on Audible if you're more of an audiobook person. I know you guys are giving some away, which is very cool, and I'm excited about that. But also really happy. You can follow me at Prof. Gerhard on social media. I'm not hip at social media. My students try to help me, but Gentelligence. But I do try to post, whenever there's something interesting going on in the news for sure. And just kind of address some of these things that are coming out, which they do come out every day. So any other questions? Anything else I can help with? All right. Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of upcoming events we want to plug super quick, and then we'll raffle off those 5 books. Hopefully everyone got a chance to scan the QR code. If not, we're going to click away for it for a moment, but we can go back at the end if you need it again. So tonight is our Cincinnati Design Awards. If you're in that market, please be sure to attend that. November 10th, our IIDA group in Cincinnati, Dayton is having their All In for Advocacy event. On November 15th, specifically for our manufacturers representatives joining us today, we're going to have an info session on our new benefactor package that is getting launched soon. The Zoom information will be sent out for that shortly. And then December 2nd, for those of you down in Kentucky, our Louisville Lexington City Center is hosting their holiday party. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and raffle off these books quickly so everyone can get back to work.
All right.
This is so cool. I've never seen this before. Look what I'm learning today.
All right. Okay, I've got all the names in. There we go. All right, book number 1. All right, Jordan Hibner, are you still on the call? If you are, whoever wins the book, just go ahead and in the chat, go ahead and put your name and the best email to reach you on, and we will reach out and get mailing information and ship your book directly to you. Jordan, are you on? You want to just acknowledge that you are here?
Thank you. Hi.
All right, great. Awesome. Book 1 to Jordan. Amy Norman, are you on? All right, I think I see you. All right, book number 2. 3, sorry, book number 3. Going to Ryan Castle. Are you still on? All right, going once, going twice. Ryan, are you still on?
They are. They're blowing up the chat right now. You can go
Perfect.
ahead, Megan.
All right, sorry. It's hard to have all the screens at one time, read the chat, see the faces, and spin the wheel. All right, book number 4. Congratulations. Are you there? Alina Sebastian. All right, should I try somebody else for book 4? Absolutely. Yep. Just pop your email in the chat and we'll get right with you.
Thanks.
All right. And the last book goes to our Halloween Tabasco. All right. Well, thank you guys all so much. We'll get with all 5 of you